Hi everyone, this is Nia and soon it's going to be Valentine's Day, so I'm going to dedicate this tutorial to create this simple set of flowery Valentine's Day cards that you can also use as Mother's Day cards or even a birthday card. I've cut out a couple of sheets of paper. I'm sorry, I forgot to actually write down the size as I'm voice-overing. I'm actually out of the country, but if I'm guessing, it would be around 10 centimeters by 14 centimeters. This is just single sheets though, but if you want, you can also make your cards open up. And for this case, you can double up the width, so it'll be around 20 centimeters by 14 centimeters opened. Okay, so let's begin. I'm going to start by drawing a silhouette of a heart on both of the sheets, since this is for Valentine's Day. I want to make sure that it's fairly large and it's positioned at the top center, since I want to write Happy Valentine's Day at the bottom or write any other messages you want. And before I start to paint on this, I want to make sure that the lines are fairly clean, so you'll see me going back and forth to erase some scratchy lines. I also want to sketch this out fairly lightly, so if I accidentally paint on top of the pencil lines, the pencil marks won't look too dark underneath the paint. After this, I'm going to go over the colors. Firstly, this is Vermilion by Holbein, Jaune Brilliant Dark by Schmincke, Permanent Yellow Deep by Holbein, Terre Verte by Holbein, Prussian Blue by Holbein, Cerrulean Blue by Holbein, and Bleedproof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. Now let's begin to paint. I'm going to start by creating a pink from a mix of Jaune Brilliant Dark with some Vermilion. Here I'm going to use my small filbert brush so I can create really simple flowers with rounded tips. These are 5-petaled flowers and I'm just going to scatter them around the really lightly outlined heart that I've sketched out earlier. Once I've scattered a few flowers, I'm going to create some viney stems. For the main green, I use Terre Verte, and to make it a bit more of a yellow green, you can add Permanent Yellow Deep. For me, I want this to be a muted dark green, so I added Prussian Blue as well as Vermilion to mute down the color. I also switched to my size 0 round brush to make it easier to create those really thin lines. Notice how I mix the green. At the bottom right corner, I just use Permanent Yellow Deep and Terre Verte for more yellow green, whereas at the top, I created more of a deep green from Terre Verte and Prussian Blue. However, I don't mix them all together. Instead, I'm going to use them as separate colors that I can mix into each other little by little. This is how you can also adjust the colors depending on the tone of green that you want. And for the leaves here, I switched to a larger round brush to make it easier to paint on some of the stems I've already painted earlier. I like to add on the stems little by little. I don't want to just paint it all over the place because I might want to add certain flowers going over the stem. And as for the color, I like to use a darker muted green for the stem and a lighter green for the leaves. It may look like I painted a lot of stems here, but you can still see me leaving out some negative space. Those are areas where I can add on a bit more detail. And I also like to add curved ones going outside of the lines. This will make the composition look a little bit more organic. It really depends how you want your heart wreath to look like. I personally want mine to have mostly leaves, which is why I'm painting it this way, but you can put less viney leaves if you want yours to be a little bit more colorful and more flowery. I also made my flowers smaller, but this will also look nice if you include larger ones as well. So this will just create a different look, but it's also going to look very pretty. As I scattered the leaves, I also left out areas where the leaves are a little bit more further apart. This is where I like to place some flower buds using a mix of Permanent Yellow Deep and Jaune Brilliant Dark. For the flower buds, I just painted them as ovals, and while the surface is still damp, I like to continue it down by adding green at the bottom and then adding really thin stems to connect it to the vines. For more color, I'm going to add some blue flowers. I'm going to paint it the same way as I did with the pink flowers. So these are just simple 5-petal flowers, and I'm also using a fairly light consistency, so the blue will be light as it dries. At this point, I'm also adding more of the pink flowers, making sure that the composition is balanced, but I do want to leave an empty space at the center of the heart where the vines are, so I can place a couple of birds. I'm just going to freehand the birds, and for this I used a mix of vermilion and a little bit of Prussian blue. I'm using a really thin and watery consistency here, and I'm going to make the birds face each other. The shapes that I'm thinking of as I'm painting on the birds are basically just circles, a smaller one for the head and a larger one for the body, but I want the protrusion or the roundness of the circle to face the center, and I straighten the back with a straight line and fill in the rest of the area. After that, I want to extend the area of the tail, and for this I used the same mixture with added Prussian blue for a more neutral gray, and I also want to use the same gray to paint the wings as well as some details for the face. To give a bit of form to the belly, I added more vermilion. I'm still using a very thin consistency here, so those value changes are very subtle. And as for the beak and the eyes, I just used my very small pen, only drawing it on once the surface is completely dry so the pen doesn't bleed out. Here I want to exaggerate some of the features, so I'm using a thicker consistency of that gray so it looks a bit more black for the wings and the tail. Now going back to the flowers, I use bleed-proof white in a thick consistency to paint circles at the center of the 5-petal flowers. Then I leave it to dry before adding on the dot in the middle. For the dot, I use the black mixture, but I also want to pair this up with a thick consistency of permanent yellow deep. Once the birds are completely dry, now I can fill in the rest of the space by adding more leaves. You can also add more flowers if you have enough space. To make the composition look a little bit more dainty, I'm going to add some swirly vines. For this, I like to use a thick consistency of a yellow-green, so you can see that I have added more permanent yellow deep in the mix. I'm also using a fairly light to dry brush load, so it's much easier to paint the really thin lines without having the paint flow out of your bristles too fast. I feel like this isn't colorful enough, so I decided to add orange flowers. For this, I use a mix of vermilion and permanent yellow deep, and I'm just painting on lines fanning outwards depending on where the flowers are facing using my size 0 brush. Once I've added a few, just like the flower buds, I'm going to connect it to the main stem, and I just use a thick consistency of that same yellow-green. I feel like the heart is detailed enough, so next I'm going to write Happy Valentine's Day. And since I'm really bad at spacing and writing in general, I always feel much better if I have a guideline at the bottom of the writing, and it's always much easier to write it in pencil first before going over it again with pen. If you're good at typography or hand lettering though, this is your time to shine. Have fun with it and be creative. You can create your own fonts or add your own flair to it. Once I'm done with the writing, I want to make sure that the pen is completely dry before erasing, and I also try to not press too hard so I don't accidentally smudge the writing, especially when it's done in black. And as a final touch, I just added a couple of flowers on either side of the writing, so I can include a bit of color at the bottom as well. And that's it for the first design. Now let's move on to the second one. Okay, moving on, I'm going to start by erasing some of the outlines lightly so it doesn't show through the painting. I just kind of run my eraser, or you can also use a kneadable eraser. Since this is a set, I'm going to use more or less the same color mixtures. I'm starting with the pink. Again, this is from a mix of Vermilion and Jaune Brilliant Dark, but this time I want to fill in the heart with flowers, and I'm going to make the flowers larger as well. I personally find it so much easier to paint rounded edges with my Filbert brush, but of course you can also do this with a normal round brush. I like to start with two colors, so the pink or the peachy pink with yellow. As for the yellow, I just use permanent yellow deep, and I try to create a few flower shapes that I try to repeat and spread within the heart silhouette. For a color that's a little bit more orange, for a slight variation, I like to sometimes add a bit of that permanent yellow deep into the peachy color, and I like to also play with the consistency. If I want something to look darker, I just use a slightly thicker consistency. You can also see that some of the flower shapes look a little bit odd. That's because I'm going to add the details once I have a few flowers down, because I do want to wait for the base color to completely dry. Now I'm going back in with a thicker consistency paint to add on smaller flowers inside the larger ones that I've painted, or add some line details for the center as well as dots, or like this one, adding some small doodle textures. I want this one to look like flower buds, so at the bottom I use a dark green. This is again the same mixture as before, and I added 3 leaves as the sepals. For the maroon that I'm using right now, this is from a mix of vermilion with a tiny bit of Prussian blue in a very thick consistency. Just making sure you know, since this wasn't a color that I used for the previous one, but it's okay because this is only going to be for the details. For the flower buds, I also added on some stems, again using the same green mixture. You can always adjust it according to the tone that you like. So I have a few shapes down, and I'm just going to repeat this until I fill the whole heart. As for the details, sometimes I like to add the stamen inside of the flowers as well by mixing lines as well as dots, and you can just play around with the color combination depending on the theme of color that you want. I'm just keeping mine simple using these warm colors, then I'm going to add some accents later on. I feel like I have a decent amount of flowers for now, so now I'm going to add some leaves. I'm starting with just scattering the stems facing in different directions, and I also made the stems curvy so it looks a little bit more organic and lively. After I paint on the stems, I add some rounded leaves, filling in the space that I have, but trying to not go over the heart shape. For the leaves, I like to use a slightly thinner consistency, but not too light. I want to pair it with some darker values, but try to not add too much so it doesn't look too bulky and heavy. If there are flowers looking from the side, sometimes I like to add some sepals, and depending on the space that I have, I might also paint them differently. And then I like to connect these flowers with a stem, and if the stems are fairly long, I'm going to add leaves as well. You can also vary the shapes of the leaves. You can see that some of mine are longer and others are shorter and rounder. And to connect this to the previous design, I'm also going to add some swirls to fill in some of the random spots. I like giving some blue accents, so I'm going to paint really small blue flowers in the empty spaces to make sure that the silhouette is more exact. For the center this time, I made sure the base blue is completely dry. Then I add dots at the center using a thick consistency of Prussian blue. And if there are some which are just ovals, I like to add the darker blue at the bottom. I feel like I can see the heart a little bit better now once I fill in the space. So now I'm going to focus a bit more on the details. I like to add the midribs for some of the larger leaves with a darker green, and also add some white dots using a thick consistency of bleed-proof white. I like adding the white details on a really saturated or fairly dark background because it really stands out. And here, this is kind of like a final touch-up. I felt like the heart was a little bit too flat, so I ended up extending the shape of the heart downwards by adding this little detail of the flowers and vines to fill in that extension. Okay, and lastly, just like before, I'm going to add the writing. I added the guidelines, wrote it with pencil first before outlining it again. Then I want to make sure the pen is completely dry before erasing the pencil marks. To be safe, you can also use a hair dryer to make sure that it's completely dry so you don't accidentally smudge the wet ink. And to make this a collection, I made sure to add those two flowers on either side of the writing, just like the previous design. And this is the finished look of the second design. These were so fun and quick to make, and of course you can play with different color variations as well. Let me know in the comments if you gave this a go and if you added some customizations for your cards. If you enjoyed this tutorial style, please consider subscribing for more. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. Thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!